The clock on the microwave showed 7:43 a.m., and I had exactly 5 minutes to decide whether I was going to spend the next 40 years wondering what could have happened, or the next 40 seconds taking action. I know how that sounds. It sounds like the kind of dramatic moment people create for videos like this, the kind of artificial turning point added in editing rooms to make ordinary moments feel extraordinary. But the clock was real. The 5 minutes were real. And the life I was living at 7:42 a.m. was a life I had accidentally built over 7 years, one small compromise at a time, until the weight of everything I had avoided became something I no longer knew how to escape. The email was already written. That is the part that still surprises me. The part that makes the whole story feel like it was written by someone else, and I was just the person who happened to live it. The email was sitting in my drafts folder. For 3 weeks, I had rewritten it 17 times. I had polished every sentence until it sounded exactly right, professional, respectful, grateful. It talked about appreciation. It talked about opportunities. It talked about making the difficult decision to move in a different direction. My finger was hovering over the send button. Not metaphorically. Literally. I was sitting at the desk in the corner of my bedroom, the same desk I had turned into an office 3 apartments ago. The same desk where I wrote the code that built the product that eventually got acquired for an amount of money people told me meant I had finally made it. The same desk where, over the last 18 months, I watched something I created become something I no longer recognized. I sat through meetings I no longer wanted to attend. I listened to people speak a language I had learned to speak but never truly understood. The email was ready. The severance package was generous. The non-compete agreement was standard. The references were secured. Everything was planned for a clean exit. The kind of exit that looks like success from the outside, but feels like surrender from the inside. Because that is what surrender really is. Walking away from something you stopped believing in years ago, but continued building anyway because you forgot how to stop building things you no longer cared about. I had created a story in my mind about that email. The story was that I was being responsible. That I was honoring my commitments. That I was leaving with integrity, professionalism, and grace. All those words people use to describe the kind of fear that wears a suit and carries a business card. But the truth I refused to admit, even alone at 3 a.m. when honesty usually finds you, was much simpler. I was afraid. Not of the unknown. I had faced the unknown before. I built companies through uncertainty. I raised money through uncertainty. I hired people, fired people, changed directions, failed, and rebuilt. The unknown was not my enemy. The unknown was something I had learned to survive. I was afraid of something else. I was afraid of the known. I was afraid of the life waiting for me after I sent that email. A life where I took the money, kept the reputation, used the network, and did the sensible thing. The thing smart people do. The thing that looks like wisdom on professional profiles, but feels like slowly disappearing when you are honest enough to admit what you actually feel. I was afraid of becoming someone who gave advice about taking risks to people who were still young enough to take them. I was afraid of the dinner parties where I would talk about the early days with the nostalgia of someone who survived them and moved on to something safer. I was afraid of becoming a mentor, an investor, a person who once built things but now only explains how others should build. The microwave beeped. 7:44 a.m. 4 minutes left. I had set a 5-minute timer because I had read somewhere that the brain makes better decisions under pressure. That artificial deadlines can interrupt overthinking. That when the mind believes there is a threat, sometimes it finally stops analyzing and starts acting. It was a ridiculous trick. I knew it was a ridiculous trick when I set it. But I was desperate enough to try anything. Because the alternative was simple. Send the email. Walk away. Become someone I did not want to become. And I had no idea how to avoid that future except by doing something that felt exactly like jumping off a cliff. With 4 minutes and 53 seconds left on a microwave timer. In a bedroom office. On a Tuesday morning in November. My phone buzzed. A message from my co-founder. Board meeting in 20. You ready? I stared at the message. I had known about the board meeting for 3 weeks. It was on every calendar. It was the reason the email had to be sent today. The board needed certainty. The investors needed certainty. The team needed certainty. Everyone needed certainty. Except me. Certainty was the thing I had been selling for 18 months. Certainty was the product. Certainty was the currency. And somehow, I was completely bankrupt in it. 7:45 a.m. 3 minutes left. My hand was still on the mouse. The cursor was still hovering over send. The email was still perfect. Professional. Respectful. Final. I could send it right now. 3 seconds. Maybe less. The board meeting would happen. The transition would be announced. The press release would go out. The congratulations would arrive from people I had not spoken to in years. The next chapter would begin. The sensible chapter. The chapter where I became the person everyone expected me to become. Because I had already proven I could be the person I used to be. My chest felt tight. Not metaphorically. Actually tight. The way your body reacts when it knows something your mind is still refusing to accept. The way you feel when you are standing at the edge of something and every part of you is screaming that the edge is not where you thought it was. I thought about the code I wrote in the beginning. Not the code that impressed investors. Not the code that scaled. Not the code that helped the company grow. I thought about the first code. The code that solved a problem I personally had. A small problem. A strange problem. The kind of problem that only matters to the person experiencing it. And maybe a few thousand other people who are silently waiting for someone to care enough to solve it. I had not written code in 14 months. I had not built anything in 14 months. I had managed. I had planned. I had optimized. I had scaled. I had exited. But I had not created. And the absence of creating was slowly destroying me. Because when you are a builder, not building feels like something inside you is slowly disappearing. Like a tire losing air without you knowing where the leak is. Everything still works. But every mile feels wrong. 7:46 a.m. 2 minutes left. My phone buzzed again. Another message from my co-founder. Hey. You good? I typed. Yeah. Just reviewing the presentation. I deleted it. I typed. On my way. I deleted that too. I stared at the empty message box. And then I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Clarity. Not the comfortable kind. Not the kind where the path suddenly becomes obvious. The kind where you finally recognize the lie you have been telling yourself. I was not reviewing anything. I was not on my way. I was not going to that board meeting. I was not sending that email. I was going to do something else. Something that made no sense on a spreadsheet. Something that would look like failure to everyone who believed in my success. Something that might actually be failure by every traditional measurement. But it was the only thing that felt like breathing. 7:47 a.m. 1 minute left. I closed the email draft. I did not send it. I did not save it. I closed the window. The email disappeared. And suddenly, I felt the strange dizziness of someone who had just cut their own safety rope thousands of feet above the ground. A person falling through air that does not care about your resume, your achievements, your reputation, your past decisions. The phone rang. My co-founder's face appeared on the screen. I watched it ring. I watched it go to voicemail. I watched the screen turn black. 7:48 a.m. 0 minutes. The microwave beeped again. The timer was finished. The 5 minutes were over. And I was still sitting in the chair. But I was not the same person who had sat down 5 minutes earlier. That person was waiting for permission. This person had finally realized something. Permission was the one thing nobody was ever going to give. I stood up. I walked to the closet. I pulled out an old backpack I had not used since the early days. A cheap backpack. The zipper was broken. I had kept it for no real reason. Except that it was with me when the work still felt like fun. I placed my laptop inside. The company laptop. The one with the security software. The one that tracked activity. The one that belonged to the company. I put it in the bag anyway. I walked out of the bedroom. I walked out of the apartment. I got into my car. And I drove. I did not know where I was going. I did not know what I would do when I arrived. I did not know how I would explain any of this to the people who trusted me. The investors. The employees. The people who believed I was someone who always made the right decision. I knew only one thing. The 5 minutes were over. And for the first time in years, I had actually used them. I drove for 3 hours before I finally stopped. Not because I had reached a destination. Because the fuel light came on. The body has needs that the mind cannot negotiate with, no matter how dramatic the moment feels. I pulled into a gas station outside a town I did not recognize. I stood beside the car in the cold November air, watching the numbers on the pump rise, and for the first time in 18 months, I thought about nothing. Not the company. Not the investors. Not the future. Just nothing. And somehow, that felt like its own kind of arrival. My phone kept buzzing. For the first 47 minutes, it was constant. Then it became occasional. Then it stopped completely. I never checked it. I already knew what it would say. First, concern. Then confusion. Then frustration. Then demands. And finally, acceptance. The kind of acceptance hidden inside disappointment. The kind that hurts the most because it comes from people who genuinely believed they understood you. And now they had to accept that maybe they never really did. For once in my life, I let people experience me without trying to control the outcome. I did not explain. I did not defend myself. I did not manage their opinions. And the strange freedom of not managing everyone's perception of me felt completely unfamiliar. Almost uncomfortable. I bought a coffee I did not want and sat at a small table inside the gas station cafe. I opened my laptop. Not the company laptop. My own laptop. The old one. The one covered with stickers from conferences that no longer existed. The one with a battery that lasted 40 minutes if I was careful. I opened a blank document. And I stared at the cursor. I had not looked at a blank screen with purpose in 14 months. I had stared at screens full of existing projects. Other people's code. Systems I was expected to improve. Problems I was expected to manage. But a blank page is different. A blank page asks you a terrifying question. What do you actually want to create? And I realized. I had forgotten how to answer. I sat there for 2 hours. The coffee became cold. The morning rush disappeared. The sunlight changed. My back started hurting. And then, somehow, my hands moved. They wrote a function. A small one. A strange one. The kind of thing nobody would pay for. The kind of thing no investor would care about. It was a function that calculated the exact moment sunlight would enter through a specific window at a specific angle, based on location, date, and the direction of the window. Completely unnecessary. Completely impractical. And completely mine. It was the first thing I had built in 14 months that nobody asked me to build. The first thing I created without thinking about users, investors, growth, or success. I looked at the code. I looked at the blinking cursor. And I finally understood something. Something no board meeting had ever taught me. Something no investor conversation had ever taught me. Something no business strategy session had ever taught me. The work was never the problem. The audience was. For 7 years, I had built for everyone. Investors. Users. Acquirers. The media. The industry. The next funding round. The next milestone. The next achievement. I had built for everyone. Except the one person who started building in the first place. Me. Not the version of me that wanted attention. Not the version that wanted recognition. The real builder inside me. The part that simply wanted to create something that did not exist before. That part of me had been starving. Starving inside a room full of other people's measurements of success. So I wrote another function. Then another. I stayed at that cafe until they turned off the lights around me at 11 p.m. I drove to a cheap motel. I worked until 3 a.m. I slept for 4 hours. Then I started again. I checked out. I drove to another town. I found a library. And I built. 3 weeks passed. Maybe 4. Time felt different when the only question that mattered was, what did I create today? I was no longer building a company. I was not chasing an exit. I was not preparing presentations. I was just making something. A small, unusual thing. Something that allowed people to point their phones at any window in the world and see how the sunlight would look through that window at any hour of any day. Past, present, or future. It had no business model. No growth plan. No investor strategy. No obvious path. By the end of the first month, it had a few dozen users. But those users cared. They wrote emails. Real emails. Messages like, I have been waiting for this my whole life without knowing I was waiting. This changed the way I see my own home. Thank you for creating something like this. And those messages meant more than any number I had chased before. I printed them. I put them on the wall of the small apartment I eventually rented. A place I chose because the light was beautiful. Because I wanted to understand why. Those emails became my only metrics. The money started running low. The savings from the exit that never happened were disappearing. So I took freelance work. Boring work. Work that paid well. Work that required my skills but not my passion. I did it in the mornings. I built my creation in the evenings. Slowly. The thing grew. Not just in users. In meaning. In depth. In the feeling that something was being made for the right reason. A year passed. The thing had a name now. Lumen. The users were no longer in the dozens. They were in the low thousands. But the strange thing was, they did not use it like users of a normal product. They loved it. They connected with it. They wrote to me about things I never expected. They told me about the windows in their childhood homes. About the sunlight that filled their rooms when they were young. About hospital rooms where they sat beside people they loved. About apartments they had left behind. And the windows they still remembered. They told me about moments. Memories. Places. Lives. And I wrote back. Every single time. I had the time to write back because I was not trying to scale. I was not optimizing every second. I was not preparing for another board meeting. I was not trying to convince anyone that the future was bigger than the present. I was simply building something. And taking care of the people who found meaning in it. Eventually, my co-founder found me. He sent an email to the personal address I never changed. The subject was simple. I heard about Lumen. The message said, it's beautiful. I never would have guessed. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I replied, I wouldn't have either. 5 minutes ago, I was someone completely different. A few minutes later, he responded. We missed you at the board meeting. The exit closed. The buyer walked away. The team split apart. Everything changed. Then he added, but I'm glad you're here. Whatever here means. I smiled. And I wrote back. Here is better. Come see the light sometime. 3 months later, he did. We sat on the floor of my small apartment because I still had not bought proper furniture. The sunlight moved slowly across the room through the window that had made me choose that place. He looked at the code on my screen. Then he looked at the emails covering my wall. Then he looked at me. He smiled. And he said, you're poorer than you have ever been. And somehow, you look happier than you have been in years. I laughed. I am. He stayed quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question I knew he had been carrying. The question anyone would ask. Would you go back? I thought about the microwave. The 5 minutes. The email I never sent. The life I almost chose. The person I almost became. And I answered. No. But I would make the decision faster next time. He laughed. A real laugh. The first one I had heard from him in years. Then he said. That's probably the only advice that matters. Make the decision faster. People ask me about those 5 minutes now. They ask during interviews. during conferences, during conversations with people trying to figure out their own next move. They ask, "How did you know? What calculation did you make? What framework did you follow?" They want a system, a formula, a way to turn fear into something manageable. But the truth is, there was no framework, no perfect calculation, no magic answer. There was only one moment. The moment when the cost of staying the same became greater than the cost of changing. That moment comes for everyone. It looks different for everyone. Sometimes it is a microwave timer. Sometimes it is losing a job. Sometimes it is a conversation. Sometimes it is a new beginning. Sometimes it is a quiet Tuesday morning when the sunlight hits the floor in a certain way. And suddenly you see the shape of the life you are not living. The moment arrives. The only question is, will you use it? Most people do not. They wait for more information. They wait for certainty. They wait for permission. They wait until the moment disappears. Then it becomes a memory. Then a regret. Then a story about the road they never took. But I have a different story. It is not a better story by the old measurements. It is not bigger. It is not safer. It is simply mine. A story about light. About windows. About creating something that did not have a market, but had meaning. A story about someone who finally stopped building for everyone else and started building for himself. A story about a life that fits inside a backpack, a small apartment, a library card, and a freedom that looks like failure to people who only understand success through numbers. But it is my story. I created it. I am still creating it. Because right now, the cursor is blinking at the end of this sentence, waiting for the next one. And for the first time in my life, I am the only person who decides what it says.